Okay, I am Aracelis Francis. You usually see my name as E. Aracelis Francis, and there's a story behind that we won't get into. But anyhow, I retired from the Council on Social Work Education in 2007 after 22 years as the director of the Minority Fellowship Program, and I returned to St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands in 2007, in the summer of 2007. And by 2008, I started teaching at the University of the Virgin Islands part-time. And by 2010, I was there full-time and stayed there until last year, which was 2019. So a total of 9 years teaching at the undergraduate level. And so I have been retired for the second time since May of 2019. Before I left CSWE, they gave me the honor of naming me Director Emerita. So that comes with free registration at APM. So I have been able to continue to attend APM. I think I have missed 2 of them. One was because my graduating class from SSA, I'm a graduate of SSA, was having their 50th reunion, probably, at the same time of CSWE, and I decided there's only one 50th, but I could go to CSWE another year. And then I guess the second time was when I got inducted into the Social Work Pioneer through NASW. So those were, other than that, I've been a faithful attendee of CSWE, but it's much nicer being an attendee rather than being a staff person, as you probably well know.
There are many challenges, but there's always so much to get out of it from being on the staff side as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've had two full careers, actually more than 2 full careers.
Yeah.
If we really look at it.
And I was also thinking that we're talking, I was reading Eddie Glaude's book, and he talked about their 2 major periods prior to this one, which was Civil War and the Reconstruction, and then the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. And I feel like I wasn't in the first one, but I definitely was in the second one. I was at Columbia when they closed the campus. Oh. And we didn't have classes at the time. The School of Social Work was at the Carnegie Mansion on 92nd Street. So we went to the YWCA for meetings because we couldn't have classes. So it's like life goes in a cycle. Yes. And the issue of racial justice goes in a cycle. And yes, we have made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot more to be done. So I have been part of all that. more of an observer than as a participant.
From the observer's perspective, and certainly living through these pieces and the leadership that you've shared with CSWE and social work education, I think will be very informative to how we look at where we are now and where we'll really be needing to go as we evolve as a profession.
It's a constant. It's a constant change, because as I was saying before we started the interview, Carl, when he went to CSW in '68, it was with the purpose of focusing on minority groups. And his first initiative was trying to identify, actually it was African-American social workers who were in doctoral programs who could possibly consider becoming faculty members. So that was the first push, because there were very few faculty of color. There might have been 1 in each university. I know when I went to SSA, there were no faculty of color. There were field instructors, but no one on the faculty was Black.
Yeah.
So that gives you a sense of the fact that there weren't any.
Yeah.
The places where you found people of color was at Howard University, Atlanta University, and the University of Puerto Rico. And that was it. Those were the three places where you would find faculty of color. And then in the other places, you might find one person here, one person there, but no group of 5 or 10 or what have you. Not that we have that today.
To be sure, yes.
But there was only one, if there was one.
Right.
So that's the context in which the minority fellowship programs developed, but it was also as a result of CSWE being able, through federal funding, to bring together representatives from each of the 5 minority groups at the time, to get them to identify what their needs were, what would be needed to incorporate them into schools of social work. And of course, the addition of what was then called 1234A, accreditation standard 1234A, was the first attempt to make sure that schools did make an effort to bring faculty of color onto their faculties. And if you're going to do that, then you have to have faculty who had the required training, the doctoral degree, et cetera.
Right.
So the one flows right into the other.
Right, in terms of that pipeline issue.
Yes, yeah.
So you bring up Carl Scott, and this year marks the 45th anniversary of the Minority Fellowship Program, where we at CSWE support social work students who are addressing the behavioral health needs of racial and ethnic minoritized communities. So for those of us who never met him, how would you describe Carl Scott?
I was trying to think about that. There's a picture of him at CSWE, and I guess that focuses my my image of him. But Carl was very apolitical and yet political. He understood how these organizations worked. He understood what needed to be done, and he knew everybody. Everybody knew Carl Scott. So he not only was known in the New York area, because prior to CSWE, he was the director of admissions at NYU and also was on the faculty as an assistant professor. So he had been in the academy before he came to CSWE, and is a graduate of Howard University, initially from Michigan. So he went from Michigan to Howard and then to New York. Carl was outgoing. He loved to party. And he was a lot of fun to be around. I really counted him as a mentor. We were going to talk about private funding just before he passed. So that was a loss that he passed before he could give me that entree into the private philanthropy area. But he certainly was my mentor, and I owe a lot to him. Yeah. And
Wonderful.
he was very astute. He knew how to get those federal funds, how to keep them flowing, who he needed to know in the federal government, who were the people. He also knew, he could also distinguish between those people who could produce and those who just talked.
Okay.
Which at the time was very important, because there were a lot of people that could talk a lot, but you wanted people who could also produce.
From the standpoint of in social work, in the mental health field, in relation to the federal government?
All three.
All three, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the terms are different. So I guess mental health is, we now say behavioral health, but it was mental health in the 60s, 70s.
Well, so you you had mentioned this earlier or alluded to it, of the context of the time. And so how and why did Carl Scott lay the foundation for the MFP that we have today?
Well, based on just need. You know, if you looked at, I don't remember how many schools of social work we had, but say we had 50 or 75. And the only places where you would find people of color were at Howard, University of Puerto Rico, and Atlanta University. And yet we're talking about educating people to work with a multicultural clientele. So how are you going to do that if you don't have people of color representing those groups as you teach students to work with those groups? So that was part of the idea behind it, that we've got to bring everybody into the circle, because by leaving groups out, you miss important knowledge and information about these other groups. So that was the context of trying to increase and diversify the social work faculty and students also.
Sure. You had mentioned earlier a little bit of the social political context of the time and how that impacted your first experiences with CSWE, Carl Scott's experiences with CSWE, and so I was hoping that you can say a little more about what it was of that period of the 60s and how CSWE and Carl Scott responded to those needs.
The 60s was really about like we're doing now with Black Lives Matter. The 1960s was the opportunity to let the world know, the United States and the larger world, that Blacks had not progressed the way they should have as citizens of the United States. And it really starts most visibly with the sit-ins in the South by the college students who went and sat in Woolworth and just stayed there until they were removed by the police. And of course, there were the sit-ins, there were the marches, and the response by the forces of repression. You know, the bull hunters, the dogs, the police, the horses, all let loose on peaceful protests.
Right.
And we have to also acknowledge television, because television brought this into the homes of everyone. Just like the killing of Floyd. Yes. Everyone saw that. Right. Well, television enabled everyone to see the segregation, the water fountains that said Blacks only, all of the things that are in museums now, but were a part of everyday life. Sure. I remember going to Tulane to attend a summer workshop, and not far from the campus, there was a dry cleaners that said, only coloreds in uniform allowed. Okay. Which meant that only if you were working for a white family and you had on a uniform could you come into that dry cleaners. And then going downtown New Orleans and not being able to get a cab to get back to campus until someone told me I had to go around the corner where the Black taxi drivers were. So that's what the television was able to show to the rest of America, that even though the Civil War was over, Blacks now had rights, a lot of it was only on paper, but the reality was quite different. So the federal government then was forced to address, well, what are the policies we need in order to make the society more equitable and provide opportunities to all these people that have been excluded. Schools of social work might have brought in 1 or 2 per year, Black students.
Mhm.
And that was like minuscule given
Sure.
the needs. So that was the context. And then the response of the federal government by providing money to organizations like CSWE, APA, et cetera, to implement programs that would bring change was really the social
Okay.
the social context. So it was a very different time to
Mhm.
what it is now.
So it's really these different forces that
Yes.
crested at a similar
Yes.
time and kind of
Yeah.
came together.
Yeah. And I think if you look at the history of social work, you look at a period like the Progressive Era, a lot of what happened in the Progressive Era was in the context of what was happening in a larger society, so that the social workers were ready to take advantage of that, but it wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the larger context. And I think it's the same thing with the emphasis in schools of social work on minorities, that something happens, policies change, and then institutions respond to that change.
Okay, great. Well, so kind of related to that, and you had made mention how there were few faculty of color outside of University of Puerto Rico, Atlanta University, that we now know as Clark Atlanta, and Howard.
Yes.
What do you see as the importance of the MFP over the last 45 years?
Without the MFP, you probably wouldn't be there. And many of the other I just looked at some figures, 600 students of color who have gone through the MFP program, that would not have happened.
Yeah.
And you still have to look at that in context, because I think before I left, I was looking at the numbers, and when I looked at the number of years and then the numbers, you realize that we're only producing maybe 2 or 3 a year. That's still small.
Right.
So there's a lot to be done.
There's still a lot to be done.
Yeah.
So I guess in thinking of, as you said, you were the director after Carl Scott of the MFP for a period of 22 years. And so in that time, from the 80s into the 2000s, how did social work change?
I think the biggest change was really the emphasis on research. I remember saying to my students when I taught at Adelphi University in the early 70s that it was very difficult to quantify what we did as social workers, that we couldn't measure it. Fast forward to 2020 and we have to measure it. So that's a major, major change. And I also think the theories that were used in social work changed, because initially we were focused on Freud and we moved into systems theory. And I think the one thing I always say to social workers or to people in general is that one of the fascinating things about social work is that it's not static. It changes as the society changes. So at one point, child abuse was like a new idea. Right. And then it's domestic violence, and then it's HIV/AIDS, and now it will be grief and trauma because of what we've just gone through. Right. So our practice changes based on what is happening in a larger society.
And so, and that change, as you say, with practice changes, social work changes, how have you seen doctoral education change over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades, particularly while you were the director of the MFP?
I think it changed in several ways. It became much more academic in the sense that as funding dried up for field instruction and for master support. I think the schools of social work then became more connected to the academies and or the universities in which they were situated. So, for example, Columbia University was seen as separate and apart. And even the fact that they afforded a doctoral, a DSW instead of a PhD, reflected that. And they wanted to keep it that way because they saw that as around control. The faculty would determine who got the doctorate. If you became part of the graduate school, then, you know, the graduate school has to have some representation.
Right.
So it took Columbia a long time to move from the DSW to the PhD. And part of that was the evolution of what was happening on the campus, and then the need to become part of the larger academy and not just this segregated school of social work.
So that this progression to interdisciplinary practice, interprofessional education, transdisciplinary research is, would you say that it's born out of that integration of, or social work being more formalized in universities as an academic unit?
Part of it is that, yes, yeah. And also, social work began to pay more attention to research. You see that in the development of CSWE, for example. Before CSWE, there were a few schools where faculty got funding to do research, but it wasn't really as large as it is now. So I could see that in the fellowship program. We had two programs, what we call the research and the clinical. And the research, students would just, yes, it would be research, but it wasn't as structured. So that during the time I was there, the research fellows eventually had to have mentorship by someone who was funded by NIMH or a private foundation. So then it wasn't just that the student went to a doctoral program, but the students had to go to a doctoral program where there were faculty who got research funding. And then the ability to work with those faculty members so that they also developed their research skills. So that was new, that was different from when I first started in the 1980s. Yeah. So that was a major change. The clinical program, I think we began to get pressure later on about making the clinical program more clinical and less academic in terms of the fact that most of our students would go into the academy. Right. And SAMHSA wanted to see more of them go into direct practice. But in terms of the trajectory of social work, by the time you get to a PhD, you've done your practice. Right. And now you're teaching about practice. Right. But it was another aspect too, that schools of social work, when I went to a doctoral program, you had to have a minimum of 3 years post master's. And then schools of doctoral programs started to take students right out of the MSW program. Right. So that changed. You had then students coming out ready to teach, but hadn't had any practice experience, so that limited them to teaching human behavior or research. Right. Because they hadn't had the clinical experience to teach the clinical aspects of the curriculum. So that was another change. And I found that the students who had practice experience and then went and got the doctorate were in some respects more marketable because schools wanted to bridge the gap and bring the clinical knowledge into the academy and begin to look at how you do evidence-based services. Right, right.
And so kind of finding that way to marry the practice and the research
Yes.
in any way
Yeah.
has become a strength.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that changed while I was there is when I first went, we would have maybe 1 or 2 students attend the annual program meeting, and we'd have a session on the MFP, and we would invite people who had completed their dissertations to come and share their dissertations.
Okay.
And then we changed it to bringing all of the students that could attend to APM, and then having them meet together as a group, get to know each other as a group, and really begin to develop a fellowship so that the students could then, because one of the things prior to doing that was that doctoral students are pretty much alone. You were isolated in your little part of a nation, and you did your work, and you know, maybe you found someone who was interested in what you were interested in, but maybe you didn't. So by having the students come together, they got to know each other. Some of them began to work together, and some still do. You know, there's some fellows who still work together in different publications. So I think that became a strength of the program. And then, of course, over time, you had former fellows who would recruit students for the fellowship program. So I would loosely say they were the grandparents.
Sure.
But it meant then that they were in schools, they could identify potential students who would be interested in doctoral education. They could direct them, support them, etc. So that the mentorship became an important part of the program.
So the fellowship and the mentoring pieces are aspects that weren't originally there in the 1970s and in the early 80s, but it's something that has grown over time.
Yes, yeah. You were pretty much on your own. I know that when Carl was there, he would try to visit the different locations where the students were, and he would meet with them, meet with the doctoral program directors, etc. But bringing them all together, bringing all the MFP fellows to APM, introducing them, having them meet together. We had workshops, etc. We had people from the federal government talk to them, former fellows. I think it created a sense of belonging.
Building that community.
Yes, yeah. And then, of course, as we got more fellows in schools of social work, they could provide mentorship to the fellows that were coming in.
Yeah. So as just to shift a little bit, but you know, for the last 5 years, we've been funding a fellowship for MSW students who are committed to providing direct practice to our target population through funding from SAMHSA. So I'm wondering if you can speak to why it's important that the MFP and by extension, SAMHSA and the federal government, why is it important to nurture early career social workers to go into direct practice focused on our racial, ethnic, minoritized communities?
Well, I think one is just a need. You know, there's so much need in minority communities, and so much of it is not being met. So that if you begin to, because I would suspect that one of the things that is done with that group is that they also form a fellowship and they get to know each other.
Yes.
And they also get to find out about different ethnic groups right in the group, because you do have representatives from all the 5 groups. And we all live in our own little areas. So if you're Latino, you know something about Latinos. If you're Black, you know something about Blacks, etc. So they would not only learn about social work, but would also learn about the ethnic groups and the kinds of needs that each group has. And I'm not sure that they always get that in schools of social work. It depends on the faculty.
Mm-hmm. And so it's trying to fill in some of those gaps, right? That we can't always cover everything in a master's program, just like we can't cover everything in the doctoral program.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was wondering, as we're wrapping up the 45th fellowship year, had started with NIMH funding, and now we're in solely SAMHSA funding. From your perspective, how far have we come in terms of addressing the mental health, or as we now say, the behavioral health needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
We've made progress, but we still have a lot to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of it is systemic.
Mm.
You know, right now, there are more mentally ill people in jails and prisons.
Mm-hmm.
And social workers are not in jails or prisons.
Right.
So they're not getting any services at all.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to find ways to get to them before they get to jails and prisons, mm-hmm. and provide services to them. And the problem is always there are not enough social workers, there are not enough trained social workers, there are not enough social workers who can work with these various groups. So we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go.